Hello and welcome to CIMA Australia's exam preparation series. This is exam preparation film 1 for the March 2015 strategic case study. My name is Cliff Bowles. I'll be your presenter for these two exam preparation films. If you've seen the other exam preparation films in this series, you'll know that I've suggested that you download the case study as soon as it becomes available, and to make 3 copies of it. And at first, to read copy 1, read it through uncritically at least 3 times before you seriously start to do any analysis. The idea is that you read it, leave it for a couple of days, read it again, and what you're doing is you're letting the scenario become absorbed into you. You're getting used to the scenario. These case studies are requiring you to act like an employee or a member of the company. So you need to soak in what this company is about. So then when you've done that, maybe you could go through copy 1 with a marker pen and without being too analytical, highlight anything that stands out as significant or rings a bell with you or seems important. Don't get too hung up on it being too precise at this stage. And then wait a couple of days and do the same thing with copy 2, maybe with a different colored marker pen just for a different view at it, and highlight the things that seem significant to you. Don't consult copy 1 and don't be too analytical. So now we're ready to do a third pass at the case study where we might want to get a little bit more analytical. But before we do, let's understand the case study level that we're talking about. We're talking about strategic case study, and the strategic level concentrates on making strategic decisions and providing the context for which those decisions will be implemented. So its focus is long term. So when you're responding to questions in the case study, you need to be looking at it from this point of view. Strategic decisions, context for which those decisions will be implemented long term. And what we need to be sure about is that we're familiar with each of these pillars, E3, P3 and F3, because the questions you're going to get asked are going to be using this syllabus as its basis. So if you haven't really prepared and studied these 3 subjects, then possibly you're not going to be ready for the exam. So you must prepare these first. We also need to consider the role that you're going to be expected to play in the case study. It says here in the CIMA materials, your role is going to be something like a senior manager. And you need to be clear about who your audience is. Your audience is going to be the CFO and the rest of the senior management team. And the exam focus for each of these 3 units is going to be as follows. E3, the exam focus is going to be the analysis of strategic options, leading to recommendations and the justification of those recommendations. So when we come to the case study, we need to have this in the back of our mind. In P3, the risks associated with this need to be scrutinized. The risks associated with these strategic options, the risks associated with these recommendations. And finally, for F3, we need to consider a financial strategy so that the strategic options that you've recommended up here are adequately funded. So we need to have these 3 case study focuses in the back of our mind when we're looking at the case study. So we might ask these questions as we're going through the case study. What are the strategic issues? And if we can identify an issue, what options might there be? What are the risks of each strategy? What are the risks of each option? And what is the financial strategy for a recommended option? How will it be funded? Have that in the back of your mind when we're looking at this case study. And finally, before we looked at the case study, I took all of those learning outcome weightings and I put them into a little folder and sorted them and said, what in terms of weighting is important. And corporate finance and financing seem to be quite high up on the list, a strategic position and financial strategies. So again, when we're looking at this case study and we're looking at making long-term strategic decisions, we need to think about these things, because it's obvious that some of the questions that we're going to see in the case study, unseen material, and the questions in the exam are going to relate to some of these high value things. It doesn't mean that those things here won't have a part to play, but on probability, we should be looking at these higher level ones first. So now let's have a look at the case study. I'm going to go through it, as it were, a third time or a third pass. I'm going to highlight some things that seem important to me. I'm going to make some comments. And in film 2, we'll look at how we might address those comments and perhaps come up with something that might be solutions or might help us to answer questions in an exam. So here's the case study. This is the pre-seen material. This is March 2015. It's for the strategic level. And the case study is about a company called Look, and I found it to be a very interesting case study. So let me just tell you what I did. I marked it up just as you would with a highlighter, and I'm going to comment on this as we go through. You may have some completely different things that you highlighted. That we're not trying to be exhaustive here. These are just things that I think I would be aware of when I come to do the part 2 of this exam preparation. So the first thing, extraordinarily very important, you are the senior manager who works for the Look Group. So a senior manager, doesn't say an accountant, a senior manager who works for the Look Group. You report to the board and you advise on special projects and strategic matters. So although you're doing CIMA management accounting, it's asking you to be have a much broader role. And so when you're doing a report or when you're responding to an email, you must play this role, a senior manager who works for this business. And what we'll do is we'll try and understand a bit more about the business. You're reporting to the board. So Look is a technology company. Obviously, when you read this case study, the parallels with companies like Google immediately come to mind. So this is a technology company founded by software engineers in 1998. So the company is not that old, but it's very large. It's based in Europe. The company has worldwide operations and of electronic and commercial presence in virtually every country. So this is not a small business. This is a very large business, and when we look at the financials, we can see that it's a substantially viable business with a lot of turnover. So it's not a little company. So this is a very senior job, senior manager reporting to the board, special projects and strategic matters. Look was created by these 3 people, Jay, Martin and Vijay, and they had an idea that led to a search algorithm a la Google, and Jay and Vijay helped him to develop the idea into a viable product. Similar to many high-tech companies developed in this, for example, the United States, you might think about Google as we're going through here, or Apple, or one of those. Each owned a third of the shares when the company was created, and like many high-tech companies, at the beginning they were short of cash, and like Microsoft did when they started, they offered shares instead of cash payments. By the time the company started to become viable, the founders held 75%, and the business was listed on the stock exchange in 2004, and this is quite important. The equity shares were converted to a special class of equity share called founder shares, and each founder share receives the same dividend as the equity shares that were issued to the market during flotation. But founder shares carry 20 votes per share. No further founder shares can be issued. So the way I read that, the founder shares are the three partners plus 10% of the company's equity shares. Are they founder shares? We're not sure about that. It doesn't quite tell us. But we know that these founder shares, whatever they are, carry 20 votes per share compared with a normal shareholder that has one vote. Look has two programming centers, one in India, one in Eastern Europe. Each of those centers hires local programmers who are generally competent to support the business. So this is outsourcing or offshoring. They've offshored and outsourced the programming. And many American companies did that, and there's been some developments of that which I'll come back to later. There are two major research and development centers, one in Europe, the other in the USA. So like many of the high-tech companies, the intellectual powerhouse is at home, but the work of programming is offshored to lower cost locations, in this case Eastern Europe and in India. It also owns facilities that provide data storage. It records every search made using its search engine. Now this is an enormous cost, an enormous task, and we might come back to that when we're looking at risk analysis. So now we're told Look's basic business model has not changed since the company was founded. So that's 20 years using the same business model. We'll perhaps come back to that and say, is this business model going to suffice for the next 20 years? Users access the software using an internet browser. When they go, just like in Google, they type in a term. It presents the user with a column of links related to commercial sites. And there's also some advertising. And the links are sponsored by Look's advertisers who pay Look a few cents every time their link is activated by a user. So if you're not familiar with pay-per-click, how Google generates funds, then maybe you need to look it up and find out a little bit more about it. The secret to making this business model successful is to provide users with useful links to commercial sites. So one of the questions I have when I was reading this, and it made me really think about how many times a day do I use Google? An enormous amount of times a day. How much revenue do I pay Google directly? Very little. And so we've got to be careful in this business that we understand that browsing doesn't necessarily provide Look with funds. And that's one of the things that they're in business for, presumably, is to have revenue. So we can see here, Look stores details of its browsing history and uses that browsing history to observe traits that can predict users' interests, and like Google, will present advertising related to the users' interests that have been observed. The algorithm, the search engines, constantly being updated. There are several competing search engines, just like there are against Google. But Look estimates its search engine is used for 60% of all internet searches, which is 120 billion searches every month. As I say, using a search engine doesn't mean that Look is going to derive revenue from it. And here we see that Look's principal competitors don't necessarily use search engines to generate advertising revenue. And we've been given here a social media, not called Facebook, but called FriendTime, who lets users post text and digital photographs and share things with friends. And they have advertising and they pay for clicks through to their websites. But FriendTime doesn't compete with Look for users, so they're not interested in the users, but both are in competition for advertising revenue. So this is the important thing that we must see. This is the thing that they're competing for. The Look search engine generates 70% of the company's total revenue, so that's a huge amount, but the company is diversified into other ventures, and there's a whole list of them. Look Space, maybe like Google Maps, and advertisers pay for clicks to their sites. And again, you need to maybe think to yourself, do you use Google Maps? I do. I use it quite often. But do I pay anything? Do I pay Google for the use of that? Do I click on anything? Very rarely. So again, what is the benefit that, in this case, Look is going to get from providing this service to the public? It may be that they might need to consider, like digital newspapers, having to pay for that service in some way. So that's a big question mark for Film 2. Look OS is their computer operating system for, I guess you could think of this as Google's Android. It's an operating system which allows notebook computers, tablet computers, and mobile phones to operate. And it's open source, which means it's freely available. It's not like, let's say, an Apple or a Microsoft. This is open source. And in being open source, there are now 900 million devices in operation. And perhaps those devices wouldn't have been in operation without it being open source. Look Apps is an online store. You might think here of the Apple Store. Each phone app is sold for very little, just a few dollars, very small fee. The margins are very small, but the volume is high. Once having got the operating system, the OS operating system, then the next obvious thing is to sell mobile phone handsets and maybe extend into tablets and laptops. But in this case, handsets, highly featured, and there's a big business here, obviously, in people buying handsets. Phones are manufactured by subcontractors. The next one is called Look Lens, and this might be Google Glass, is a similar sort of thing. Look Lens is something to enable people to read emails and text messages without looking at their phones. Now, many people might look at this and say, well, this doesn't look very promising, but when a lot of people have looked at many of the things that are now commonplace, their first reaction might have been, it's not very promising. The PC, when it was first started, many people said there's not a market for it. So what I think you need to be considering here is that you need to be looking as what's called the next big thing. It may not seem like a big market now, but it could be, and this is what innovation does, it could be something that might turn into the next big thing. Look Media, it allows subscribers to download or rent films, television, obviously a hugely developing market. They're just accessing third-party products and selling them and paying a royalty to the copyright. Look Cloud, lots of people in the cloud business, cloud storage, enabling people to store things outside of their own location and allows people to search their files. And there's good and bad about this. Look regards each of these ventures as mutually supportive, and they're synergistic, they're complementary, and again, we will have a look at these later. And one of the things that you might want to think about, and we'll look at Film 2, is this strategy of complementary products. Selling one, opening up a market for another. So we've got an organization structure. We have the three founders as senior operators. Jay is the group chief executive. Martin is the director of online operations. And Vijay is the director of innovation. So these three founders are still very much involved in the development of the business. Even though the business has grown substantially, and has an external investor base. These three are still the key players. There's a number of divisions. We've just looked at those. Look Space, Look Media, Look Cloud, Look OS, and so on and so on. And these have their own senior managers that operate these product divisions, if you like. Importantly, Jay Martin work very closely together still. They focus on matters that interest them. And they delegate much of the responsibility for the company's supervision to their fellow directors. So we need to look at this very carefully. The three founders argue their vision created the company, continues to sustain it. For example, the Look Lens is a speculative venture. VJ has convinced the other two of its potential. They take it to the board and they get a commitment to proceed. So we need to come back and look at that more carefully. Finance, treasury, marketing are centralized service departments that support the whole group. This is, to me, an important thing. Other operational matters, human resources, health and safety, are left to individual divisions to manage. I guess there's a question mark there about consistency, about reporting, about standardization. Another big issue that might arise, centralized information system, but one of the divisions, Look Search, if we go back to the organization chart, Look Search here, down here, this division is responsible for providing IT services to the whole entity. So centralized information system, responsibility of Look Search. Other divisions are invoiced for any use they make of their services. So when we're looking at intercompany transactions, here we might have the source of some intercompany transactions. The question might be, is this a good strategy to have one division take responsibility for all of the information systems, or should there be other models or other options? So from a strategy point of view, here's another question that's being raised for me. The board comprises two executive directors, Jay Martin and VJ. So that's 5 executive directors, a non-executive chairman, and 3 additional non-executive directors. So on the face of it, we've got a 9-person board, 5 executive and 4 non-executive. But I might come back to that in a moment. So the company has 20,000 employees, so this is a substantial company. And one of the key things that you can see here, Look needs to retain staff in the face of competition from other technology companies. Highlight that, very important. Look, pay staff to develop themselves. Again, if you look at Google, Google will allow its staff to have some time where they can work on whatever they think is appropriate, ideas that might benefit the company. They can develop their own ideas, and that's been very fruitful for them. So again, that might be a strategy that we want to look at more carefully. Usage of the internet has grown dramatically, as you can see from this graph. Internet searches, these are billions. The rate of growth has declined significantly as usage has gone towards saturation point. So when you see those words saturation point, you start to think strategic direction. Look's analysts, they believe that internet users will spend more time on mobile devices, social media, online music and video, but not necessarily conduct more searches. So, strategic direction shouts out here. What is the strategic direction of this company when the reason that they're first got into business to develop a search engine that could have revenue generating capabilities, but maybe it's come to its saturation point. So This is the big question. We have a comparison of the share prices of Look and the share price of one of its competitors, FriendTime, if you like, Google and Facebook. And what you see when you look at that is there's a correlation here. They look as if they're moving almost in unison. And what does that mean? Well, they're growing together, but we need to look into this a bit more carefully when we come to the financials. So we've got the share price in cents here over time, and we might be able to use that to do some calculations. So we're told they've got two mission statements. The official one, connecting people to the world, and their intention is to make knowledge instantly accessible. Now that is a mission that the founders would certainly have, to make knowledge accessible to those using the company's service. But again, this is a business now. This is a global business, and this is not a business that's run by 3 people who are doing it for just their own ends. So there's perhaps a conflict here. And the founders believe that Look is a powerful force for enhancing the good of society. So that's wonderful. It really is. But you might have other people in the business that think Look is a global business and should have perhaps a different mission statement. The unofficial mission statement is do only good, and this underpins an extensive ethical code, which is very laudable. So we have a SWOT analysis. It's quite brief, and you might wish to give some more thought to that. And certainly in film 2, we'll be looking at a SWOT analysis and other types of analysis to look at different strategies. Look's main strategic priority is to maintain market dominance. So market dominance of what? Of the search engine, of the searches, of advertisers. So we're not quite sure what that means. It certainly requires economies of scale to attract users and therefore to attract advertisers. Advertisers only come from users clicking through, and that's the only way they can generate revenues. And the loss of significant market share to a competitor could lead to disproportionate losses. We don't really understand what that means yet, so we need to give that some more thought. When we look at the SWOT analysis, the strengths, although these are brief, they look okay. The opportunities, brand image, OS platform, so those are opportunities. The weaknesses and threats obviously are things that we need to look at very carefully, and we'll do this in film 2. Dependence on programmers and other specialists, and perhaps it might be good to look at what some of the high-tech companies in the States are doing about that. I mean, it's nothing new. And obviously they're going to be dependent on the internet for delivery of service. If the internet goes down, their business stops. Is there any way around that? So these are the weaknesses. The threats: online privacy and online regulation. In Australia, there's a great deal of talk about metadata, about people's privacy, about the right of government to keep track of what people are doing on the internet. And another threat that we'll look at a little bit more in a moment is the low barriers to entry for potential competitors in segments of the search engine market. Maybe Look, like Google, has a lot of users, but there are a lot of competitors in specific areas of searching. So if I want to search for a better price for my health cover, for example, I probably wouldn't go to Google. I'd probably go to a specialist search that has brought together all of the health providers, and the same maybe for credit cards or air travel. So these threats are very real. We need to have a look at this board of directors a bit more carefully. Jay has developed the business model, so obviously he must have a business brain. Martin writes the algorithm, so he's the scientist, and VJ appears to be the ideas man, the person that gives ideas, and that's a good combination. Somebody can have ideas, somebody that can turn those ideas into something like a real product, and then somebody that can develop a business on that. So let's have a look at the other directors. The Director of Finance. Now this is a global company. She's been the Director of Finance since 2007. She's held senior position at 2 manufacturing companies and the Finance Director of a small bank. I don't know. I mean, does she have the experience to run a global financial business? Question mark for me. Victor Lee, mobile devices, seems to be somebody with a lot of experience and a lot of capability, and the business development of the mobile devices show that it's going in the right direction. But let's have a look at these non-executive directors for a moment, because this is an area that worries me. The non-executive chairman, he's got lots of experience as a retailer. He's been a finance director. Multinational, yes. He's got some finance experience. He's got some quoted companies. So this man looks like he's got some good experience. And again, if you look at Google, for example, you might want to do a research on the chairman of Google and see what sort of experience that sort of person has. And we'll look at that a bit more in film 2. Alison Gordon, non-executive director, background in software engineering, telecommunications, PhD in systems architecture. Good software experience, but a member of the audit and remuneration committees. Probably not enough experience in finance for the business of this size to be a member of the audit committee. Michael Yip, experience in telecommunications industry, director of operations in an unquoted company, director of an unquoted bank. So whether this person's got the right sort of experience for this type of size of company, I'm not sure. This one, the last one, Mara Reynolds, really worries me. A non-executive director who's been given a job simply because of her loyalty and long service to the company. She cannot be independent and cannot be a non-executive director. If we discounted her as a non-executive director, then the board of 9 would have only 3 perhaps really independent non-executive directors, which probably doesn't seem enough. The Internal Audit Department, looking for a mixture of people with accounting and computer science backgrounds and able to cross-train them, which is good. Focusing on compliance audits, traditional compliance audits. The question might be, is that enough type of auditing, particularly with the advent of people hacking systems and attacking them? Maybe compliance audits are one thing, but risk audits might be an area that they might wish to look at a bit more carefully. Risk-based approach to planning and conducting its investigations. It's good to see the word risk there, but we need to know perhaps a little bit more about their risk assessments. So here's the financial statements for September 2014 with comparison September 2013. Revenue is increasing, cost of revenue. I'm going to come back and look at this statement of profit and loss when we do a comparison with the competitive friend time. So in film 2, we'll do maybe some horizontal and vertical analysis. Just a point, companies like Google, certainly from an Australian point of view, have been accused of not paying sufficient tax. And when you work out the tax expense as a percentage of profit, I'm not sure you can do it directly like that, but they're only paying 16% tax. That's gone down from 20% in the previous year. And again, I think we need to look at that. Most big multinational companies have some sort of tax minimization in place. Consolidated statement of financial position, a very strong balance sheet. Most companies would die to have such a strong balance sheet. couple of questions that we're going to look at a bit more. Goodwill, I've marked here, note 5, and intangible assets, which we'll look at when we look at the notes. And further down, everything else looks okay, but further down, accrued expenses, $3.5 billion, 3.4 the previous year. There's no indication of what that is or what those expenses are. I have no idea. So maybe I'm just flagging that as something that I'd like to maybe learn some more about. So in consolidation, we're told that intergroup balances and transactions have been eliminated. What we need to do, of course, is what sort of transactions. We perhaps know that there's been some intercompany charges for the use of IT. We perhaps need to understand what sort of transactions there might be. Cost of revenues, content acquisition costs. Again, we don't know enough about that. We might need to know some more about that. Software development costs. There is a standard for the development and capitalization of in-house assets, and I think in film 2 I'm going to talk about that just to make sure it's being done properly. So if we look at the segment analysis by product, obviously it's dominated by Look Search, but here you can see no revenue for Look OS because this is an open source system. It's given away free, and really it's a marketing tool, and one wonders whether this cost of revenue ought to be a marketing expense because it is to do with developing other things. No revenue here yet for this product called Look Lens, although there's substantial development costs here. And one of the things that I wrote down, life cycle costs, how much has been spent so far in previous years, do we know that? Is there any target costing for these products? If we look at the geographic segments, we see that Asia and Australia is very low on a population basis by comparison with Europe and the US. So is there a market there that might be available? Certainly in this area, the income of the people in that area is growing. Also down here, when we look at current tax, and we understand that some of this is movement in deferred tax, when we look at that current tax as a percentage of operating profit, we see it's 14.3%. So again, I flag that as something I'd like to know more about, and we'll look at that in film 2. In the notes about PP&E, I would just be interested in this impairment adjustment, and in intangible assets, these are patent rights purchased from third parties and the charge for the year. And obviously the question is, how is the impairment of these patent rights being dealt with? And we talked about goodwill on the balance sheet. Goodwill increased as a result of the acquisition of memory games. Now, we don't have any other knowledge about what this acquisition is all about, so possibly that might be something that might come up in the unseen material. The share capital, founder shares, equity shares 20 million, which ties up with the balance sheet. However, we're told earlier that for every founder share has 20 votes. So if we multiplied 1980 by 20, we would have 39,600 compared with 18,020. So the external shareholders from a voting point of view are about 32%. So we might need to calculate using this number the earnings per share and then compare it with the voting rights. Reference material 4, risk factors. 3 things here. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. We don't know what it's about. But certainly the new P3 risk management would be very appropriate for some of these things that we're going to look at here. And I've just highlighted lots of risk factors here. We must respond by developing our own strategies. When you see the word disruptive to ongoing business, capacity to impact on our business model, can affect the demand. So all of those things are things that we need to consider seriously in the strategic options about this business. There's a lot of talk from many governments about security and privacy, not just of the use of what people are doing online, but the ability for governments to access that data and to use it for various purposes, some of which are to do with security, but some of which may not be to do with security. So we've got to be careful about this thing called regulation. There's political motives. For example, in China, things like Google and Gmail are limited by the government there, and where people can't get access to, let's say, this company Look, and let's say they can only get access if Look prohibits certain searches, for example. There might be some accusations of political bias. So again, a very tricky area here. Legal liability, particularly with cloud-based storage, if something happens and the data gets lost, or there's some legal argument about who owns the data, and there's some very clouded issues here. What happens if it gets lost or corrupted? So again, there's some very serious issues here that we need to address about the use of cloud storage. Malfunction. When somebody makes something for you, there might be malfunctions. That's possibly a risk that most people are in the manufacturing offshore or outsourcing do. The supply chain, working conditions, again, bad publicity can affect sales. So if you're having things made in poor working conditions in third world countries, be very careful. Anybody who's got an internet business have got to be careful about attempts to disrupt online services, malicious access, spam, viruses, hackers, all sorts of things. Interruption of communications. If a cable, underwater cable in the Pacific gets damaged, it can knock out lots and lots of markets. Is that a risk? Key personnel. If we need highly skilled people and yet the market also requires those highly skilled people, then we've got to make sure we put some strategies in place to keep those people. And can somebody come up with a device which will block ads? For example, whenever I'm watching television and it's a commercial channel, I always mute ads. And if I had a piece of equipment that could stop me having to see the ads, I'd buy it. And maybe that's the same with the internet. So again, that ad blocking could be a serious threat to this business. In film 2, we also need to ask the obvious question, what other risks exist? We can't just assume these are the only risks. So we have to ask the question, what other risks are there? Then we have a CSR report, a corporate social responsibility report. My first comment was, why is it here? What is this? What is the purpose of this reference material 5? It's all wonderful stuff, it's great, but how does it relate to this case study? Why is it here? So that's the first thing. Words like externalities have been used in previous subjects. So again, if you're not familiar with those sort of words, you need to be clear about them. Again, if we see these phrases, carbon offsets, and if you're not familiar with what carbon offsets are, maybe you've got to do some research. And what they're doing is they're telling you all of the good things they're doing. They're putting money into research in ways that perhaps are nothing to do with their core business. And they're funding things with universities that are research projects that stand a realistic prospect of success in the long term. So is this an area where new business opportunities might come? And might this be turned into a strategic option So that might be the reason why it's here, to use their good name, strategic option, fund something that can help their business in the future. So here's the case study, the Western Data Center. Again, as I read it, my first question is very interesting, very good, but what has it got to do? What is it here for? And there's some good things here. They're doing the right thing. The idea is perhaps this doing the right thing. Can this be made into a business strategy in some way? That's the question I had when I was looking. So many of Look's products reduce users' environmental impact significantly, and maybe what we need to think about here in reading this and the previous CSR report is that it may be that the mission needs rewriting. The mission of this company needs rewriting. Instead of connecting people to the world, maybe the mission should be improving environmental impacts or something. I don't know yet, but I'm not sure connecting people to the world is appropriate now for where the business is. So what they're talking about here, they're saying information that would previously have been accessible through a journey to a library can now be accessed from a computer or mobile phone. Well, that sounds wonderful. It might have reduced the environmental impact, but you've also got to take into account the infrastructure. For example, the mobile towers, the cables. Has that had some environmental impact? So maybe we've got to be careful about a one-sided look here. The efficiency of the algorithm makes fewer demands on the infrastructure. Well, it may do, but the growth of the service, the growth of the demand is creating much more use. So we can't just look at the environmental impact from one-sided point of view. You've got to look at it both. This idea of integrating searches with bus and rail timetables, this seems to me to be a real possibility where you can have a service that you can charge for. So this, like Google Maps, if you could integrate it with bus and rail or train or airplane timetables, that would be a very good product. So here's an option for a strategy. Here's the words carbon footprint again. They're talking about physical disks. With the cloud, you don't need physical disks, but you still need servers and you still need computers. And there's the possibility also that the customer is a captive customer, and the customer certainly has risk if Look has all their data. One of the strange things here, all staff can reclaim the cost of external classes of training regardless of its relevance to their roles. That to me seems quite strange. So one of the things that we need to maybe consider here is these good things that they're doing, are they consistent with the business as a public company? So this is an important piece of information. One of the founders and the innovator, it seems, of this company is perhaps not enjoying life as much as he used to when the internet was perhaps more a development area, and when he was just working and developing things. It's very different than when you've got a board of directors, you've got external shareholders, you've got market regulators, you've got auditors, and all of the trappings that come with a big public company. Maybe his temperament is now not suited, and this is a classic case of a business going one way and the founders going another way. Not everybody is able to adapt to that corporate environment, like, for example, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. So it's rumored that he's looking to step down from the board. It may be that Look is now just another large corporation which is answerable to the capital markets, and the way that employees are treated. No suit, cafeteria, free coffee. Most high-tech companies are doing that now anyway. So what's different about this? It's quite possible you might take some money and start up a competitive business. So this is the thing that we've got to be careful about here. So very important. Competitor analysis. If you're not familiar with Google's pay-per-click, become familiar with it. Become familiar with how Google gets its revenue, how Facebook gets its revenue. These are the models that you need to consider, and you're going to have to be an advisor to the board. Huge company. You're going to have to do some research before you sit this exam, I'm sure. Let's have a look at some of the competitors in this field. Well, there are other search engines. Okay, and here it costs users nothing to experiment. I can download a search engine for free and I can start to use it. What makes me stay with one search engine? Just habit. I have no emotional attachment to it. It's just habit. If somebody comes along with a search engine that looks better and feels better, I might change. So it's a big issue. One of the other big issues is specialized search engines. I mentioned this earlier. They're often called portals. And it might be, for example, if you want to go to Webjet, it's a place where you can go and get flights. You can say, I want to get a flight from Sydney to Manila next month. Find me the cheapest flight or the ones that leave at a certain time or something. And these are going to do a search for you, find the ones, and give you various options. And there are many of those around now. So these are taking business away from the Googles of the world because these are specialized in one particular area. Lots of insurance is sold this way. Lots of hotels are sold this way, and so on. So you might also look for an e-commerce site. I want to buy some shoes. I can go to a site that just specializes in shoes, and I don't need to use Google. These are e-commerce sites, lots and lots and lots of them, and I can buy with a credit card. I don't need to click through Google. So that's certain direct competitors. Other competitors are things like social media sites. In this case, for this case study, Friend Time. But have a look, for example, at Facebook. And there's lots of advertising in Facebooks. So advertisers themselves have Facebook accounts. Okay, so you can have a Facebook account for a particular business where you can get product information. So they don't compete with look for users, but what they're competing with is the advertising revenue. So it might be cheaper to put up a Facebook page for your business and advertise through to the other Facebook users than to use Google's pay-per-click or AdWords, which can be quite complicated to use. So these are growing fast and have the potential to expand dramatically, which is going to affect, in this case, Look. So Look Media is a progression, a logical progression for Look, but it's a different business model. What you're doing here is like the App Store, the Apple's App Store. You're selling sales directly to users, and you're selling other people's products. There's no barriers to entry, really. You've got to pay royalties, but you need volume. Cloud computing is crowded with competition. There's lots of it around. The Look phone, the Look operating system, and Look apps are effectively one business. So if you want to see a similar business, look at Apple. Apple has iPhones, it has the App Store, and it has its own operating system. So it's faced with a single dominant supplier, Apple, that's caught the consumer's imagination. So you're up against a very large competitor with a lot of funds and a lot of willingness to use those funds. Look Lens, a confusing business proposition. On the face of it, it looks like a waste of time to me. asking people to use contact lenses, and the company is going to produce prescription lenses. So again, this is providing a solution to a problem that doesn't seem to exist. It might appeal to early adopters, but is it going to be a long-term business? So again, this is a big question. Do we go with that and see how it goes, or do we dump it? You need to think about this. Finally, we have the financial results for Look's competitor Friend Time. And when you do the comparisons between Look and Friend Time, you get some very strange numbers. And we'll look at this more in film 2. For example, Friend Time's cost of sales is 27% of sales. Look is 36%. Friend Time is spending 18% of sales on sales and marketing. Look is only spending 10%. Friend Time's operating profit is bigger than Look's, even though it's got almost $12 billion less revenue. Friend Time is paying 10.7% in tax. Look is paying 16%. So we need to look at these very carefully. There's some really serious issues here that we need to examine. But when you look at the balance sheet, we've got a couple of other things that we need to consider. Friend Time has a very low cash balance, 874 million. But Look has an enormous amount of cash. And maybe it's got to consider using some of that cash to do something. So we might want to also look, when we look at the share capital, we might want to look at earnings per share for a Friend Time investor and for the non-founder investors. So that's the third pass of this case study. A very interesting case study, and if I were you, or before I film 2, which we might look at some of the issues, some of the options and strategic directions, have a look at Google a bit more carefully. Have a look at Facebook a bit more carefully. Have a look at Apple a bit more carefully. In this exam, you're going to have to be a senior manager of a global company. And what's expected of you as you do a report or send an email or a communication to the board is that you are familiar not just with this business, Look, but you're familiar with the market. And you need to do some research for yourself so you become familiar with Google, its history, its revenue streams, its financial statements. Do the same with Apple. Do the same with Facebook. And see what you can glean, and we'll look at this in film 2. So, a very interesting case study, and I've enjoyed looking at it for you. So, bye for now.